처음 영상이 시작되면 화면에는 아무런 메뉴가 나오지 않습니다. 이때 영상 화면에 마우스를 대면 아래에 메뉴가 나옵니다. 만약 화면에 마우스 클릭을 하게 되면 영상은 멈추기 때문에 마우스 커서만 대셔야 합니다. 그 다음에 자막 메뉴를 클릭하시면 화면 중앙에 영어로 된 자막이 나타납니다. 이 상태에서 자막을 선택하기 위해 설정을 클릭합니다. 설정을 클릭하면 자막을 선택하는 메뉴가 나옵니다. 여기서 자막을 클릭합니다. 그리고 자동 번역을 클릭합니다. 그러면 다양한 언어가 나오는데 여기서 한국어를 선택합니다. 한국어를 선택하면 화면에서 보듯이 한국어 자막이 시작됩니다.
I've been playing around with the idea of a second curve for 15 years or so, ever since I had an interesting conversation beside the road in Ireland outside Dublin, the lovely Wicklow Hills outside Dublin. I don't know if you've ever been there. Very beautiful, easy to lose your way, which I did. So stopped beside a man at the road and I said, am I on the right road to Avoca? And he said, indeed you are. He said, indeed you are. Just go on up this hill, over the top, down a bit, you cross a stream, a little bridge, and you'll see Davy's Bar across the other side. You can't miss it. It's bright red. Have you got that? So I said, well, I think so. Up the hill, down the hill, stream, Davy's Bar. Yeah, he said, well, 1 kilometre before you get there, turn right up the hill. So, very Irish direction, of course, but as I drove on, of course I missed the road to the right up the hill, got to Davy's Bar, turned back, and as I turned back and found the road, I thought, there's a moral in this story. And so that became my curves. Just to show you what they mean, that's the first one. I call that the road to Davy's Bar. And actually, I maintain it's the line of all things human, of our lives, of anything that we create, whether it's a business, an organization, a government, an empire even. You have a bit of investment at the start, training, education, money, whatever. Money gets things going, it takes time, and then you are successful for a time, whatever success means in your world. But then everything peaks and goes down and ends up at Davy's Bar. Your life, everything that I know. Of course, that's very depressing, and all you can do is work out where you are on the curve and, you know, how long you've got. And I did interesting experiments with organizations, asking people at the top where they thought they were in the curve. Of course, about halfway up, lots to go, and going down the organization, people at the bottom, where do you think they are? Way over the top. You know, interesting boardroom discussions. But to get out of this depression, you can have a second curve. Of course, the snag is you have to start the second curve before the first one peaks in order to cover that dip of investment at the beginning. And of course, at the moment where you have to start the second curve, that's when you think everything is fine. And so the status quo is the enemy of new thinking. It's the enemy of the second curve. And that's the great snag. It's the catch-22 of all this. At first, you see, 15 years ago, I used it to try and prod organizations and indeed individuals to rethink their futures and to be a bit more creative about their long term. But this last year, as everything seemed to be in turbulence around it, what I think of as the great disturbance that's happening in our society, both in terms of values, in terms of politics, in terms of technology and so on, it seemed to me that so many of the things that we do in this society and in other societies seems to have been designed for an age that is past. And so a lot of the stuff we do, the way we run our country, is no longer fit for purpose. And of course, you know, it's very difficult to persuade people, you know, that who are, you know, because the country's going okay, sort of, that they need to change anything dramatically. So I thought I would go beyond my normal territory of organizations and human behavior and so on, and look at other aspects of society. Not so much as to prescribe, but to provoke people, particularly the next generation, who still have time to say things could be different. Because I think so much of our stuff seems to have been designed in the Victorian age. It just doesn't work anymore. just to take you on a quick sort of overview of the sort of things I'm talking about. And to start with, I want to tell you about a second curve that I think was absolutely disastrous. Because the second curve, in my view, is not just a new thing. It's a new mindset, a new way of looking at the world. And this second curve was to do with the purpose of a business. Long years ago, I gave a talk here called What is a Business For? And it seemed to me, when I was in business, it was quite clear what a business was for. I worked for Shell many, many years ago. And I remember the managing director, one of them, coming down at our first day of our induction course. And he said, we have a very important job to do. We have to keep the energy of the world going. And the way we do that is getting as many customers as we can and giving them as many of our products at a fair price as we can. And we were judged, indeed, on market share. That was the one number that really counted. And of course, if we did it well and at a fair price, which is largely set by the competition, there was a surplus, which you might call profit, most of which we needed in such a big long-term company as Shell to reinvest in the company's future. We paid a rent to the shareholders, which included a slight risk premium, not very high in the case of Shell, and nobody bothered. Nobody bothered about the share price particularly. It wasn't terribly relevant. Anyway, organizations in those days were basically run by people with an engineering background or by accountants or largely by people who had been in the armed services in those days. We're talking about the 1950s and early 60s. And then in the 1970s, the economists decided to pay attention to that question, what is a business for? Particularly people at the Chicago School, led by Milton Friedman, or Uncle Milt, as they called him. And he said, on I think it was the 12th of September, 1970, in an article in the New York Times, that the shareholders were the owners of the company, and that the directors and the managers of the company were the agents of those owners, and that the point of business and the only social responsibility of business was to make as much profit for those owners as possible. Nobody challenged that premise, though in fact it was wrong in law and in reality. In law, a company cannot be owned, it's an individual in law. And in fact, the average share is only held for 10 months these days. Of course, there are some major shareholders who hold them longer, but in no sense can you own it. You can't tell, as a shareholder, you can't tell the board what to do. The only power you have is to sack them, but you all have to get together to do that. So all you're entitled to as a shareholder is a stream of dividends at the discretion of the directors. Anyway, nobody challenged it. And then two of his younger colleagues, Mike Jensen and Bill Meckling, who'd gone to the University of Rochester, produced a paper in 1976 which spelt out what they call the theory of the firm. And they basically said, yes, the point of the firm is actually to make the shareholders rich, and indeed the managers and agents are the agents of those people. And in order, they added, to give them an incentive to work for the benefit of those shareholders or those so-called owners, they should be given things called share options, which, if they went up, they could cash in at the price at which they were given it. A form of stealing from the shareholders without their knowing, it seems to me. But anyway, that was the start of the shareholder thing, and of bonuses tied to the share price. And the results were predictable, of course. Managers increasingly decided to increase the share price, which is very easy to do, to manipulate it by cutting out long-term investment and so on. And now 80% in America, 80% of senior executives' remuneration is tied to the share price through stock options. And naturally enough, you will focus on the short term, and naturally enough, you work very hard to remunerate yourself as well as the shareholders. Your things go together. So lately there's been a rush of share buybacks by the big corporations in America, and to some extent in this country. If you buy back your own shares, the price of the remaining shares goes up a little. So if your remuneration is tied to that share value, it's very nice. So we are bleeding the big corporations of money for new investment. If you buy back your shares, you're really basically saying, You run out of ideas for the future. Anyway, that was a second curve, a totally new way of looking at a company. And to my mind, it was very disastrous. Most second curves, I hope, will not be so disastrous. The other one, of course, that people look at is what's going to happen to me. What is going to be my second curve? Because I have to tell you that when I joined Shell, they told me that I would retire at 62 and I would die within 18 months because there was no worthwhile life after Shell. And it was true. It happened. That was statistically true. Now, of course, there's a 20-year gap that we have yet to fill. In other words, we're living 10 years longer, and we're leaving organizations in our mid-50s more often than in the mid-60s, 10 years early. So we've got 20 years when you're going to have to find something to do. And for most people, that something to do will also involve money, because you won't have enough. So what's the second curve going to be? Well, I suggest to you that it means actually redefining what a job is. You all have jobs. In other words, you have sold your time to some employer, or most of you have. A little story. A friend of mine some time ago came to me and said that he'd been made redundant. He was in advertising and he was 48 years old. And he said, it's ridiculous, I'm as fit as a fiddle, my mind is bright, I play squash every day or every week. How could they get rid of someone like me? And I said, well, it's in advertising, I'm afraid, that's the nature of the beast. You're too old for it. There aren't any more jobs for you like you used to have in that particular industry. Just at that moment, the electrician that was working on my house popped his head around the door and said, terribly sorry, I've got to buzz off for a minute, I've got another job that's urgent. And I said, note, he's used the word job, but he doesn't mean an employer. He means a customer. And I said, the new second curve for many of you, for many of us, is actually a job that means a customer, not a job that means an employer. And that's a new way of looking at it. And so long ago, I advocated for people over the age of 50 that the portfolio approach to life, that you have several jobs or several clients or whatever. But that's the second curve for that. But then I went on to more interesting things, which I'll try very briefly to cover. I looked at the education of this country, and when you think about it, it's bizarre. Do you really think that teaching people all the stuff that we know as teachers and getting them into their heads so that they then go into a long big hall and sit and try and write it down from memory by handwriting, which they've never used before because they actually type. And what's the point of memory when you can actually, on the smartphone, all the stuff that you need is there? I mean, do you think this is a fit way to prepare people for life? I mean, I would suggest to you, I'm sure that you wouldn't disagree, that intellectual intelligence is all very well, but what we really need is emotional intelligence to cope with the kinds of world that we're seeing, and which is mainly full of relationship problems and so on. The trouble is, it's very hard to score or to mark emotional intelligence. And I'm afraid to say that too often teachers teach what can be taught and we measure what can be measured, which means that a lot of the things that should be measured aren't measured. A lot of things that should be taught or learned aren't being taught or learned. And somehow we have to rejig our education. I mean, basically, we're turning out brilliant brain boxes who are incompetent because they don't know how to actually handle relationships or create things or whatever. I mean, isn't it a shame that 20% of the people who leave school at 18 have the reading age of an 8-year-old? I mean, that's not going to prepare them for the world. And how can we do this? So my argument basically is that we totally need to rejig education, particularly, for instance, make the school leaving age 14. And the next 4 years should be basically a form of apprenticeship for everybody. It can be an intellectual apprenticeship, if you're going to be a professor, but it can be a scientific apprenticeship, or it can be a mechanical engineering apprenticeship. But somehow, basically, the effective school leaving age should be 14, of a traditional schooling. We should then have tailored apprenticeships for everybody, for instance. I'm not saying that all my prescriptions for the second curve are right. I'm trying to provoke, not to prescribe. All my ideas, in fact, would need a dictator to implement, because politically they're going to be very difficult. As somebody said, most governments know what they have to do. What they don't know is how to be re-elected after they've done it. So hence a dictator who doesn't need re-election is what we really need. And just as another outrageous suggestion, let's redesign the welfare state. Let's not privatize it, but let's personalize it. Some of you may be familiar with Singapore. They say Singapore is a small country, but it's the same population as Scotland, bigger population than Wales, 3 times the population of Northern Ireland, so you know. And their government expenditure is 14% of GDP, and ours is 42%, though Mr. Osborne is trying to bring it down. But he won't get it down to 14%, I assure you. How do they do it? Well, the answer is that they have personalized the welfare state. Actually, the British did it for them in 1955, when it was still a Crown colony. And what the British did is they set up something called the Central Provident Fund, which has now been expanded. In the Central Provident Fund in Singapore, you pay as an employee or as a worker of any sort 20% of your gross salary into this Provident Fund, and your employer pays 16%. So that's 30% of your gross salary goes into this Provident Fund. And that has 3 parts. One is a provision for your retirement or life after work that you can't touch until you're 55. The second is personal savings, which you can draw on for education or housing. And the third is Medisave, as it's called, which is used to top up the very basic provision that the Singapore government will pay for in terms of health. That means all the expenditure that we pay on the national health and on benefits is actually removed from the government expenditure and is put into this Central Provident Fund. But the difference, so it's the same money. The difference is that instead of it being a tax that you pay, which the government then, in its wisdom, spends for you on the health and retirement pensions and so on, it is your money, which you get an account every year from the Singapore government saying how much money you've saved, actually, and how much you can spend. So it's your money, and you see, therefore, it's an investment, not a tax. And if we did that, we could reduce income tax way down and to compensate for having to pay up 20% of your salary. But you can't see any government doing it straight away. We could, of course, make a start by taking the national insurance and making it a personal contribution to a Provident Fund. We could work out what the real premium is for the National Health Service and make that you pay, rather like the BBC license fee you pay into it. Now, the point of it all, why you should do that, is in Singapore, you really feel that you have some responsibility for your own future, because there you have contributed to it. You haven't paid a tax. You've made an investment in your future. So I'm suggesting that a second curve thinking would much more concentrate not on taxing people, but on getting them to invest in their own future. Now, as I say, no government is going to do that because it would take 60 years to get the whole thing going. But it's actually really, in a sense, what Beveridge actually wanted to see happen.